come. Yes, I already. Okay.
We'll start. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pacific Region Forum on Business and Management Communication. I'm Rosalie Tom, Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lamb Center for International Communication. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Klaus Meyer, who is Professor of Strategy and International Business at the China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai, usually abbreviated as CEIBS. Prior to joining CEIBS in 2011, Professor Meyer taught at the University of Bath, University of Reading, Copenhagen Business School, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and the National Chengdu University in Taipei. Actually, Klaus and I overlapped some of us in terms of some of the schools that you have taught at. I taught at the Copenhagen Business School. I don't know whether you recall it. Then I spent my sabbatical year at CEIBS in 2002-2003. Professor Meyer is a fellow of the Academy of International Business and a vice president of the Academy of International Business. And he oversees the 2014 meetings in Vancouver, which are here in June. The title of his talk today is Chinese Multinationals Going Global. Professor Meyer's presentation will be followed by a question and answer period. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to your class.
Thank you, Rosalie, for your kind introduction. Thanks for inviting so many interesting people. We have a very diverse audience, so I hope I can deliver something for all audiences. I think we have students, we have academics, we have professionals. Everybody will have different expectations. So what I've prepared is a very general talk about the topic rather than an academic paper, and I hope to generate some discussion. And I hope to manage it in 45 minutes so we have time to manage the discussion. I'm going to make three arguments, basically. First argument is that Chinese companies are maybe very big and they're very, very successful at home when it comes to international business. They're, however, still at an early stage of a learning curve. Some of them move learning very fast, but a lot of the things that some people may find puzzling, we can explain by the fact that they actually have relatively little experience. The second argument I'm going to make is that Chinese companies often use strategic asset seeking specifically to acquire assets overseas that help them both to build global competences and to actually strengthen the position back in China. The third argument is about state-owned enterprises, and I'll offer some reflections over to what extent it matters that many of the biggest investors from China are actually what we call state-owned, even though that's a very broad category. So that's sort of the outline. Just as an introduction to the topic, on this graph you see worldwide FDI flows as measured in balance of payment capital flows. You see it's been increasing fast. Of course, these are not inflation-adjusted numbers, so it's a bit exaggerated, but you see clearly an increase, but you also see the numbers are very volatile. And now, to make it very clear, I've put China in red. So you can see, actually, if you go a few years back, China is not very important, but it's at least on the map. The Hong Kong is also in red. The red here is Hong Kong, right? PRC comes in over there. It becomes a bit clearer here. This graph shows, again, China in red. So we've seen a sharp increase in outward FDI from China around 2005. But although we were going to focus today on China, it is part of a broader trend of multinationals from what we call emerging economies becoming players in the global economy. We have seats in the second row there, but also first row, so please take a seat. In addition to China, you see especially Russia becomes a major source of FDI, but also countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and some Latin American countries. Right? For them, it's not just China who are becoming more active on the global stage. Right. To get us into the first theme of learning processes, 2 weeks ago, I was in Africa, more precisely in Ghana, and I was flipping through the local magazine, and the first page, they had the the best cartoons of the year, what we were laughing about in 2013. That was the #1 cartoon. So what we see is the Chinese left a big footprint on Africa, and President Obama is coming and is looking a bit puzzled, partly surprised, and himself making some footprints, because of course he made a big tour and he met people, and of course he has roots in Kenya, but sort of the perception in Africa was, okay, he's coming late, and it's a little bit too late and too little relative to the engagement that Chinese business in particular have in Africa over the last years. If you think about it from an economic perspective, the opportunities of China and Africa working together are very big, right? China has capital, Africa needs capital. China has expertise in building infrastructure, Africa needs infrastructure. Africa has resources, China needs resources, I mean natural resources. So the complementarities are there, so the business opportunities are huge. The question that I've been asking myself during this week in Africa was, are they really in a good position to take advantage of those opportunities to mutual benefit? This figure illustrates the presence of China. The industries are sort of interesting. This is by capital flows, and then unsurprising, I guess especially Canadians will not be surprised, oil and natural gas is #1, other mining is #3, iron ore is #5, copper is #6, and in between we have some infrastructure such railroad, dams, civil construction, airports, and so on. So it's raw materials and mining on the one side, and infrastructure, the big sectors that attract large volumes. And you see them all over the continent, particularly in Zambia and Zimbabwe. There's a lot of mining activities. West Africa is a bit more diverse. Now, these numbers are big projects. Now, when we look at Chinese investors, we have in Africa, there are also a lot of individual entrepreneurs. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about is big companies investing, Chinese multinationals. But technically, if you have a small company in China and you have one subsidiary in Canada, you're also multinational, right? And if you look at the numbers of investment, they are also big, but they tend to have a very different pattern. Like in Europe, they're, for example, very strong in Romania. And so there's some countries, some of these small countries have quite substantive Chinese populations. So I'm mainly talking about going to be big companies, not the individual entrepreneurs, although that's an important phenomenon in its own right. Okay, now during this week, I was talking to a number of people. I read the local newspaper, just getting some impressions, what's going on, what's the relationship. And there's some, on the macro issue, I had said there are opportunities, but there are also concerns whether or not the deals are really mutually beneficial. So the African people were asking questions such as, is the interest rate we pay on that big loan the Chinese give us appropriate? Aren't they overcharging us? The second bullet point is something the Nigerian central governor made a point that sort of was widely discussed, that because Chinese investment is in mining and infrastructure, in Africa, actually, the manufacturing is moving backward. Africa is very, very weak outside South Africa, very weak manufacturing base, and that's getting weaker. So the traditional economic structure is reinforced, and the African people really want is more manufacturing. And another issue that I sort of more indirectly said, people in Africa don't really trust their own politicians. Now, if you're good friends with those politicians, that can spill over in a negative sort of way, right? That's the second. Also on the personal level, now the people I was mainly talking, this is an EMBA class. My school, CIBS, runs an EMBA program in Africa, and these are the participants, and so that's sort of my main basis of information. And that what I got from them, I mean, these are people who are relatively open to people from other countries in general, including China. But what I heard was that they perceived the Chinese not being attractive companies to work for. Right? There's one story that I think Bharti Airtel, they have the Indian telecom companies have a very big operation in Africa. And they wanted to outsource. So some employees were going to be moved to the outsourced companies. Some of it was outsourced to Ericsson, some of it was outsourced to Huawei. And so all the employees that were sort of moved to Huawei quit their jobs. Everybody wanted to go to Ericsson, right? So there is a reservation about working for Chinese companies among people in Africa for a number of different reasons. And that's something, the way I see it is China is at an early stage of developing international business. And what I've just talked about relates to being at an early stage of developing relationships with people who are totally different. Europeans have been present in that part of West Africa for a long time, and not necessarily positive, right? People in Nigeria, Ghana have negative views about about especially British people because of colonial history, right? So there's also some antipathy. But they sort of learned how to deal with each other and in a pragmatic sort of way. And one point that may explain this tension is a lot of the Chinese expats are on an expat assignment for the first time. European multinationals, American multinationals would have a pool of people who are experienced in working in different cultures, right? Whereas for Chinese companies, in my generation anyway, the next generation, much more opportunities. I guess some of the students here may be from China. You come to Canada, you build experience about Western society. If you go back, you're in a much stronger position than your parents' generation in terms of bringing in an understanding of other cultures. People in my generation didn't have that opportunity and come into situations such in Africa with relatively little cross-cultural competences.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So the story I'm trying to develop here is Chinese companies are still at early stages of a learning process. And maybe in Africa that's more evident than in North America, Europe, where maybe there has been more interaction over a longer period of time. This is the theoretical model, internationalization process model, pretty standard in the international business literature. The basic idea is when you invest overseas, you make a commitment to a location, to a market. Based on that commitment, you learn, you build capabilities, including cross-cultural competences in working with people, but also assessing market opportunities, learning how to deal with the institutional environment. And those capabilities then enable you to recognize opportunities, to assess risks, and to reduce the cost of further expansion moves. And so you have step-by-step process of making more commitments. What Chinese companies often have done, they've made very big commitments early on, right? And if you make big commitments with little experience, it's high risk. High risk means you may fail, but you may be very successful. But I see it as a high-risk strategy to make very big commitments if you don't have built a lot of international business experience. Right? That's a sort of theoretical argument. Now, what do I mean with international business experience? I think the best way for me to communicate that to a Chinese audience is, okay, look at these stupid Europeans that come to China and they make lots of mistakes. They don't understand, why do I have to meet government officials all the time? What is this thing with Guanxi? What's that about? Why do I have to enact that? How can I get a Chinese court to enforce my intellectual property right? Right? How do I create loyalty about consumers? They're so volatile. How do I mean, the staff seems very eager to, the company on the other side of the street offers 5 yuan more salary and they jump jobs already, right? How do I deal with these sort of things? Those are the questions that Europeans in China would struggle with. Actually, the last question is something Chinese companies also don't have answers for. How do I deal with the post-1990 generations? Now take the other point. If you look at the mistakes others make coming to your country, that gives an indication of the mistakes you're bound to make when you go overseas. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. You have to learn from the mistakes, right? So, how to interact with the media? Very difficult because the media operate very, very differently in a Western society compared to China. They write stories about you and you think they're totally misrepresenting it, but you can't really do anything about it. What's trade unions? Okay, put the word trade unions in your dictionary. Something comes up, but it's very different. A trade union in European functions differently. So these are all examples of things that a Chinese company would not have experience in dealing with, and maybe they don't even anticipate that there are issues that they have to learn. And that's actually the most tricky things, right? If you don't know that you don't know something, you don't look for it, and then you run into problems. So this is illustrations of what I would call international business knowledge that companies need to build up. How do companies build that up? Traditionally, it is through learning process, which is internally. It's also recognized that, well, if you work within business networks, you share knowledge in business networks. Very important for small companies. And since China is a very network-oriented society, obviously the learning that happens in networks, in alumni associations, etc., is also relevant. But you can accelerate that. One is building an entrepreneurial team with people who have international experience. It's still very challenging in China because there are not that many people who have international experience, although sea turtles coming back are helping, especially when it comes to startup companies. It's more difficult for mature companies to integrate people in their leadership team that come from overseas. The second bullet point, learning from importing and inward foreign investors, that we actually see a lot in China. Most Chinese companies, the first international business they did was become the local intermediary of a foreigner coming to China, and that's a starting point for a learning process. Learning from others in the same foreign countries, well, that's why you have Chinese Business Association in Canada or in Ghana in that case, wherever, right? You talk to each other, like the German, I have contacts with German Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, those networks, also very important. And then you can acquire resources, you can take over a local company. That's high, again, it's a high risk way, but it's a one way of learning. So what I observe, generally speaking, is Chinese companies do all of these things. Some of them are very successful in accelerating their learning very fast. But if I see Chinese companies run into problems somewhere, I always try to see it from this perspective of the learning curve. The fact that someone runs into problems today doesn't mean they do something wrong. They're just experimenting, they're trying, they will be successful in the long term. But making failures along the way is part of doing business, right? Especially if you make high risk early on commitments. The second theme I like to talk about is this strategic asset seeking foreign investment, which is a way to accelerate building capabilities for global competition. The interesting thing is that Chinese companies often buy selectively assets overseas, not just to get into the local markets, because that's traditional, traditional model, textbook model of international business. You buy a company that has a local brand name, local distribution network to get into the local market. But we see particular common among the Chinese companies, they buy companies that have interesting brands or interesting technology that either helps them on building a global presence or build a presence back in China. Because after all, the biggest market, the biggest country, the fastest growing economy is China, right? Even though Chinese companies go overseas, the most attractive market may still be in China. Now, this is from a survey done by colleagues of yours. Professor Lee is over there representing Jack Austin Center, was involved in the China Goes Global survey. In the 2011 edition, they asked about the motives, and I classified here the motives by market seeking, efficiency seeking, natural resource seeking, and strategic asset seeking, which is in our literature a traditional way of classifying the motives for investing overseas. And you see this motive of strategic asset seeking is quite common, especially when we talk about investment in Europe and North America. And since my roots are in Europe, I'm particularly interested in that. And you can see that it accounts for, these two, brand and technology together, almost 50% are mainly driven by strategic asset seeking. Now, from the 2013 survey from the same source, they classified the motives a bit more detailed, and then I tried to map it back on the same terminology. You can see the green one is market seeking, which is what you expect to be important, right? I've studied multinational enterprises, foreign market entry for many years. Most foreign investors are going international to seek overseas market. There are important motives related to that. Now, then you see the second most important motive is efficiency seeking, reducing the cost of your operations, reducing labor cost. But for the Chinese companies, that's up there. It's the blue one, efficiency seeking. It's not important. Natural resource seeking, they have only one item here. Energy and raw materials comes out somewhere in the middle. But I think that reflects that for some companies, it's the one motive, like in energy and natural resource sector, it's the most important motive, whereas for other companies, it's very low importance, right? So it comes up with an intermediate position. And then we have a lot of items that you can classify as strategic asset seeking. Some of them I wasn't quite sure. So this upstream, downstream industry chain, I wasn't quite sure how to classify that. But some of them you can see are very important. And actually, the ones related to brand are more important than the ones related to R&D, which I found interesting. So the motives here, acquiring brand, manage experience, upgrade their own brand in the domestic market, which I presume means market in China, because this questionnaire admits that in China, are very important. And that is an answer that I wouldn't expect in that way if you make a similar survey in another country. Does anyone know any of these companies? Any company you know? Probably not. They're all German companies. Which one? The first one? Probably that's not the company you're thinking of. There's Schneider Electric, but that's a different company. This was actually a computer company that sort of disappeared. Okay, these companies all have been acquired by Chinese companies. These are all German companies, and most of them are either in machine tooled or in automotive suppliers, except Medion in the middle is computers, software. So in Germany, we've seen a lot of these acquisitions, and all of those fall under what I would call strategic asset seeking. So the driving motivation have been the brand, the technology, or combination of the two. In the early stage, the one on the left-hand column here, they were done before 2005. In the early stage, the target companies in Germany were often companies that were illiquid or had really serious financial crisis, wouldn't be able to survive, and they were happy to find someone who wanted them. And the Chinese were happy that they could buy a company cheaply, which, however, then means restructuring wasn't all that easy. But that was a phenomenon of the early years. That's not what's happening now. these companies may have had some financial difficulties, but they're certainly not facing liquidation threats or whatever, with the early acquisitions fell in that category. Another shift over time is that many of the early acquisitions were by state-owned enterprises, whereas more and more of the companies on towards the right end are private companies, the acquirers. Let me just introduce one case study to you. Dürrkop Adler is industrial sewing machines. That means the sewing machines you use in a factory, large-scale factories. It was acquired by Shandong Group in 2005. At that time, the company was facing serious competitive challenges. And now I've taken some quotes from the interview with the CEO. The basic motivation from the Chinese perspective was that Chinese were becoming market leaders in China with products that were better value for money than the German company products. I mean, the German products would be perceived as the best, but they're too expensive, basically, especially in the Chinese market. So in China, the Chinese companies would overtake them. And then the main competitors were in Japan, and to challenge the Japanese competitors, Chinese companies wanted to get into the premium segment, and that's where both the German technology and the German brand would potentially help them. Now, of course, the acquired company were very concerned what's going to happen. Now, this was one of the first major acquisitions by a Chinese company in Germany. So there have been negotiations, and the trade union became involved. But basically, the Chinese company said, we want to keep the German operations. We need to reorganize it, though. And they actively went in, and they didn't necessarily transfer production to China, but they moved it to Czech Republic and Romania. The Czech Republic is very close to Germany. Right? So we're talking about exploiting the differences in labor costs within Europe, which are, of course, less than the labor costs compared Germany versus China, but it's still important and an important way to reduce labor costs. And so they were able to return the company to profitability. 2013, they acquired a second company, and in that moment, of course, the challenge of integration changes to integrating the two German operations, the two companies that have been acquired in Germany. At that time, they had acquired some competences in how to do business in China, so we have to see a learning process. And also this company was making losses, so they had to do some active restructuring. Well, the interview was done shortly after the acquisition, so it was too early to say whether they succeeded. And then actually I think it's the first company that I know of anyway that's made 3 acquisitions in Germany. Now they're trying to move even further up market by acquiring a company that is doing customized products and more designed, more leading edge technology development sort of stuff, right? So that these 3 companies together then would represent their European operation. Now, what are the challenges they faced in this? Initially, the main challenge that the CEO emphasized in this interview is about trust. And this relates to, of course, the theme that I was talking about earlier, cultural differences, and the Germans don't know how to deal with a Chinese boss sort of situation, right? So they had to earn the trust, and they had to, from the Chinese side, they had to learn how to deal with trade unions, because they have a very different role in an organization in Germany compared to China. Once they proven they can do it, that the company actually grew its market, grew sales, then things worked for them, right? Then they had the workers and the local support, local community and so on, support, in their support, working with them, right? But they start out from a position of needing to prove that they can do it. And I think that's not unusual. What was key factor for successful turnover? Well, communication, but also keeping the German management team in place which is related to the fact that, of course, a Chinese state company in their leadership team in the year 2005 wouldn't have terribly many people who speak German and know how to operate in a German sort of environment, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, right? So this is a company that's been relatively successful, and with those 3 acquisitions, you can also see some learning processes going. But the second time they do an acquisition, they know much better what's going on. This slide sort of summarizes the typical pattern that I see as the Chinese acquisitions in Germany. Typically, the Chinese company is a big company, diversified company, competing in a mass market sort of segment where large volume and small margins are how you compete. And many of them were in state-owned enterprise, although that's not necessarily so anymore today. The target companies in Germany were sort of, the business model is different. They're highly specialized, niche market segment, premium segment, where it's really the profit comes from the margin, not from the volume, right? Different way of doing business. Often global leaders, often privately held. That's also interesting because if you have a private owner, it's easier to make a deal. If it's a listed company, it gets much more complicated, especially if the Chinese company is owned by an entrepreneur and the German company is owned by an entrepreneur, and the two get along with each other. Entrepreneur talking to entrepreneur, they have to speak a common language in a way, right? Not exactly the same, but they find it easier to communicate with each other than if you have a state entity or if you have a listed company. You know, the mindset of entrepreneurs is there's more similarity. So that actually helps. Early ones were financially difficult. And the sensitivity of the issue sometimes comes from the fact that some of these companies are in small towns where it's the main employer in the town. And then, of course, everybody in the town is concerned what's happening with takeover. But that is independent. There are also cases where the previous owner was an American private equity, and the managers were happy that the Chinese took over because they actually got more freedom to run the company after they got rid of the private equity. You know, so it depends always. And U.S. companies are, because of their labor management practices, not necessarily the most popular in Germany these days, like General Motors and Amazon, and I suppose a third one that has some serious conflicts with the unions these days. How are we doing for time? Okay. And if I'm doing so okay, then I'm going to take a break. Ha! Cannot open. Okay. Sorry, that doesn't work. No. I know why it doesn't work, and I can't fix it. The most sorry, I want to show you a video, but I didn't upload the video to this one. I originally was thinking I used my own laptop. Anyway, Sany is one of the biggest acquisitions. We've seen this 2 years ago now. They took over Putzmeister. Do you know what a concrete pump is? Probably not. A concrete pump, if you build a skyscraper. When I was young on a construction site, there were men who were carrying the concrete up the ladders wherever it was needed and pour it out from a bucket, right? But then nowadays the technology is that you basically, the wet concrete is pumped up, and so you can build skyscrapers. Of course, China builds lots of skyscrapers, so there is a lot of need for concrete pumps. So it's a huge sort of thing. German companies used to be leaders in that particular industry, but the Chinese companies have been catching up. And partly because of the financial crisis in Europe around 2007, 2009, the German companies were not doing terribly well. And so there were 2 German companies, both have been acquired by a Chinese company. One by Sany, the other by Qigong. Now, The question then is, now if I'm teaching this, having the discussion with EMBA group, these are the questions we discuss. What to do after the acquisition? Because the Chinese companies have relatively little experience in managing a company overseas. The main objective is to reverse transfer the knowledge. How, however, do you reverse transfer knowledge if the target company is on a technologically more advanced level? So they have actually better understanding of technology. Moreover, how do you transfer the knowledge if it's actually embedded in the organization and not held by individuals? It's not like you get some patents, you take the patents back to China and use them. The reason why German manufacturing is so efficient is because of the whole infrastructure of vocational training and so on. And that has not just something to do with happening in the company, it has to do with the education system around it. So it's not something you can easily pick from one country and move to another country, right? So those are the sort of challenges that companies like Sany face. This video is available on YouTube, so you can enjoy it at your leisure. Now, there is research on this topic, not much, I have to say, unfortunately, but there's some scholars in Germany who studied these companies, and they find that this light touch integration is what companies are doing. So the target management stays in place, right? Most acquisitions, you see that the management get kicked out and the new bosses set in their own people. That, of course, requires that you have people who understand the business, who understand the local environment, and so on. So in the acquisitions we've seen in Germany, very often the local management stays. And in the Sany case, they did, although 18 months later, they changed the CEO, which, of course, then triggered a lot of gossip because everybody was asking why, and there was no answer. So they didn't get along with each other as well as they thought they would. The brand name stays in place. That's really unsurprising because the brand name is the main target. The issue then is how do you use the different brand names in different markets? In the Sany case, Putzmeister is basically the brand they use worldwide outside China now. In China, they have both brands. In China, the Putzmeister organization is sort of integrated with the Sany organization to some extent. Elsewhere, they're totally separate organizations. Sany is active overseas with all its other products because they do excavators and some specialist cranes and so on. But Putzmeister is the brand they use for concrete pumps and worldwide because Putzmeister has the distribution network. So the acquiring company offers strategic advice, but gives a relatively much autonomy and is represented on the supervisory board. Well, in Germany, you have a two-tier board structure. It's like non-executive board members in an Anglo-Saxon governance structure. They try to facilitate two-way learning, but what these scholars find is a major challenge is what academics call absorptive capacity. Absorptive capacity is basically your ability to learn, your ability to understand what other people say depends on your prior knowledge. Like if we have the most bright nuclear physicist talking to us today, I would understand nothing because my gap is too big. I don't understand anything. I don't have the basics, so I don't understand the expert, right? So if the gap between the knowledge in the one organization and the other organization is too big, or they have different ways of communicating, that communication is very difficult. So making this knowledge exchange happen is a major challenge. And there are human resource challenges. Now, the expert for human resources is here, so you can ask Rosalie after that how to manage people. Okay, so that's the second theme, strategic asset seeking. Investment, very common, very ambitious, but it's also challenging from an operational sort of side. This third theme, and you have to stop me, I don't have a watch here. The third theme I want to briefly talk about is, does it matter that Chinese companies are often state-owned rather than privately owned. The state ownership is especially common in mining, utilities, oil and gas sector. It's in manufacturing is more mixed. So when I was talking about the German companies, we see a lot of private companies as well as state enterprises. So it depends very much on which sector. This is the largest investment in Latin America. In Latin America, you see the biggest projects are related to raw materials, and they say here public. I call them state, right? Most of the companies where it says raw materials are state companies, and these are big projects. In the latest report from the China Goes Global, that's Simon Fraser University report, they have the 20 largest projects in Canada. Only one of them is not in oil and gas. And I don't know all the company names, but Sinopec, PetroChina, CNOOC are certainly state-owned. Right? So the state-owned companies are very important in these sectors. Now, the report also says that the state enterprises are different in certain aspects. And this is copy-paste directly from that report. The challenge, however, is, are these differences simply because state companies are big? Right? The average state company investing overseas is several times bigger than the average private companies, and the private companies is several times more profitable than the state companies. Right? So there's basic structural differences already in China, and that, of course, has implications on some of these features. Especially if they have bigger investment, that's not surprising if they are bigger companies. So further detailed research is so this is an area I've done some research myself, which I will try and briefly summarize. So the next 3 slides are slightly more complicated because they are trying to summarize some empirical research we've done. So the first study here, we are looking at state enterprises across a large number of countries. So this is not just Chinese companies, but a large number, lots of different countries. And we are asking ourselves, in which ways are the state companies different from the private companies? Well, the state companies potentially are different because they have certain motives of existence, certain objectives that the policymakers impose on them, which relate to the domestic economy. For example, creating employment in the local community, helping the development of the local community, developing infrastructure in the local community. Now, keep in mind, a lot of state enterprises in China actually are not central government, but local government owned. Right? That's a complication here. But also, there are other in economics, there are people who talk about state enterprises are really used by elites to extract rents. Extracting rents doesn't necessarily mean bribes. It may also mean doing favors for political friends, right? So that literature is also there. But both the positive or the negative objectives that you may see relate to what you do at home, and therefore that would mean that state companies are less internationalized. What we find is that if we use various indicators of the country in particular, to what extent are there control mechanisms in place to monitor the leaders of the state enterprises? Do the people who lead the enterprise, whether it's politicians or managers, have a lot of power to do whatever they want to do, or are there social control mechanisms, regulatory control, or is there a powerful stock market that creates monitoring? And basically, now we have rule of law on the horizontal axis. For high levels of rule of law, they are pretty similar. For low levels of rule of law, there is a bigger difference. So our argument is that if the rule of law is weak, there are likely to be much bigger differences between the private enterprise and state enterprise compared to solid rule of law. Second paper I briefly want to introduce which is co-authored with colleagues at CMS as well as with Jing Li. We are looking at how companies adapt to different host countries. Our basic argument in this paper is that state enterprises face more suspicion in host countries because the host societies don't understand what the state companies really are all about. They see that the state companies get preferential access to bank loans, maybe to subsidies, they have other benefits, so there's a perception of unfair advantages. Some people even associate them with like hostile government policy from another country, whatever. So there is in host societies, some host societies, some suspicion around state enterprises. And in consequence, state enterprises have to work harder to gain legitimacy in that host society. Right? You have to demonstrate to the people in the host society that you are playing by their rules, you're respecting them and their ways of doing business, their economy, right? You're not trying to superimpose something from your country to that country. And to some extent, you could argue every company is subject to such pressures, but because state enterprises start out from a point of bigger suspicion, they are under stronger pressures of this sort, right? Now, two ways of making such adaptations or trying to gain legitimacy is, first of all, to avoid direct acquisitions, especially hostile takeover, right? But an acquisition always triggers a lot of public debate. And therefore, if there is already suspicion in the host society, that may trigger a lot of debate and then work against you. So you may want to avoid acquisition. Or if you do an acquisition, you may want to take a minority stake. Don't take over the entire company, but just take a small stake. Maybe increase that stake over time. And we think that the pressures on companies to show their legitimacy is stronger in countries that are characterized by these three characteristics: rule of law, shareholder protection, stock market development, and technology intensity. And I don't want to go into why we think that, but we find some support empirically for the hypothesis that in those countries, state enterprises make more of this sort of adjust their entry strategy in this way. So those are two empirical studies that speak to the question, are state enterprises different? I know that is a public debate in Canada, so there may be questions now on that issue, but I'm not an expert on the mining industry, so certain questions I have to immediately say, sorry, I'm not the expert, because I anticipate a lot of questions here, political questions on this issue will relate to mining issues. Okay, let me finish by venturing a forecast, talking about the future. I think a lot of the multinationals, not just from China and from emerging economies in general, will fail. They will fail because they make very high-risk investments. It's in the nature of business that if you take high risk, you may fail and you may win. Now, if we see companies fail, a lot of analysts, like some people think, some of my academic colleagues, now Professor Lee's PhD supervisor comes to mind now. Anyway, Professor Rugman would argue that they have no substance, they don't have any ownership advantages, they are bound to fail because they don't have technology, they don't have brand, they expert. That's nonsense. The reason they fail is because they do high-risk strategies, right? They do have competences. These competences, however, are of a different nature than the competences companies in North America or Western Europe have. If we look forward, first of all, many will fall and stand up again. Of course, it's tough to fall and stand up, but I think Chinese people are pretty good at that, but actually Americans are not too bad either. The survivors will be stronger, and there will be second-generation companies who learn from the first generation. right? And so in that sense, Chinese multinationals are here to stay. Maybe not exactly the same companies that we read about today, but they will be around. That's all I have prepared for today, and now I look forward for discussion or questions.
This happened a few years ago. I heard it maybe at an event about India about 5 years ago. Supposedly, about 10 years ago, I could be wrong, I understand, I'm saying I don't get it right there. India was made by the International Monetary Fund to allow the transnational corporation, Coke, to enter their country. India did not want Coca-Cola in their country. They asked them to leave for a number of years, and the IMF said they had to come in. They had to allow Coca-Cola to come in. Now, when they came in, one thing they did was rob, as I say, my understanding is that they robbed farmers of water, for example. Well, actually, since I don't have all the things, can you talk about this?
About Coca-Cola in India? No, I haven't studied Coca-Cola in India. India at some stage had very restrictive regime on foreign investment and inward. Now we're talking inward investments, a very different topic than what we're talking about today, right? They've liberalized for a lot of good reasons. Consequence of the liberalization, Indian economy has strengthened for many years. Now it's been slowing down again. It's not as successful as China. There have been conflicts around multinationals about Coca-Cola uses a lot of water to produce their drinks, right? And if they pick up the groundwater in certain areas, that may have effect on local communities and how that managed. I can see that there are conflicts, but I don't know any particulars. But I think it's a set of issues that's very different from the outward investment that I want to talk about today. So unless you make a link to the topic, I'd prefer to move on. Yes, please.
This question is from Mr. Wu, and actually he wants to ask, how about the Japanese companies acquisition, the multinational companies? So do we have any learnings from that?
The question is, can we compare the Chinese companies in the last 5 years to Japanese companies 30 years ago, right, when they made the first step on the global stage? There are certainly similarities, but there are also differences. The global economy has changed. So if you want to make that comparison, China today, Japan 30 years ago. Today, capital markets are much more mobile. It's much more easy to acquire a company in a different country compared to 30 years ago. Right? So my understanding is that Japanese companies use acquisitions as a mode of entry much less. Also, in terms of developing their capabilities, I think they're much more homegrown in terms of Japanese companies developed organizational practices that gave them competitive advantage in certain industries. And so there's a certain Japanese management practice which contributed to their gaining competitive advantages. I don't at this stage see any Chinese management practice that would be the basis for the international competitiveness of Chinese companies. I don't see something distinctive about Chinese management practice. It may evolve, but at this stage I don't see it.
As you see Chinese state-owned enterprises buying companies in, say, Canada or other developed nations, how are they adapting to
Can I pass the question on?
So I don't have any systematic evidence. The thing I know is just some random examples. So for example, China Gold, they donate money to Canadian Cancer Society to try to gain legitimacy. And for CUG, they try to keep their headquarters in Alberta and hire lots of people there and promise to be listed in the Toronto Stock Exchange. So I think these companies try very hard to show their legitimate players in the market.
Basically, the suggestion is that Chinese companies are aware that, or have learned that they face suspicion, let's say, as neutral as possible, that people don't know how to deal with it. So they have to prove to the host society in different ways that they're legitimate. And successful transforming a company is one way. Providing resources and being very patient is another way. Engaging with the local community is another way. Yeah. Okay, you first.
You mentioned earlier that one of the successful strategy for a current foreign company would be maintain the management intact, and the agrarian firm is recommended to provide strategic advice and lead decision-making for the team.
This is an empirical observation. It's not necessary. It's the model that they actually do.
Right.
It's not. I'm not necessarily saying that's the only way to do it, but well, it seems to be the way to do it. That they don't have the capabilities to do otherwise. But please proceed.
So my question would be, how do you actually resolve the issue when you actually have a confrontation or a conflict between the management team, what they want, and the actual requirement
Yeah.
of what they want?
Yes. I think that's a serious question. Because initially you can empower the local management to run the company, you support them, you listen to the. But in a capitalist society, economy goes up, economy goes down. At some stage, the acquired company will hit some difficulties. Financial performances are not satisfactory, right? Every couple of, it's simply a matter of business cycle that sooner or later they will face that situation. And if you have this loose integration, you don't have a mechanism to really deal with that. You need a very intensive personal interaction between the local management team and the headquarter management team for that to work. And since it's across a cultural difference, and small German family company, big Chinese company somewhere, very little experience with intercultural stuff, I see that as a major challenge. Right? So at some stage, those Chinese companies that really do this loose integration approach will face the situation that it doesn't work. And then they have to address it. They may have a lot of confidence in the German management team, but that confidence may not always work out. Recommendations. I think what Chinese companies, if they really want to be global players, they have to make sure they bring more international experience in the leadership team back in China, in whichever ways. Whether they bring in sea turtles, bringing in the foreigners who sit on the board is going to be very challenging. That's what Sunny tried, but apparently it didn't work out because the guy resigned. Right? The German person who was the manager of Putzmeister became a board member in Sunny, but 18 months later he resigned. So the background of that is not clear to me. So, but the people at the top of the organization have developed more understanding of how the global economy works. Right? The risk is that people are very successful in China, and they're leader in the largest country of the world, so they may underestimate the challenges of doing business elsewhere where the rules are different and so on. And so in some way or other, they have to bring in that international experience. But that means the CEO should spend some more time overseas, spend more time with the local management team, or you deliberately bring people who are foreign educated. Actually, foreign educated may not be good enough. In some other research I do, some Australian co-authors, we looked at the performance implication of hiring people with international experience. We have 3 different variables. One is for leadership experience, one is for just work experience, and one is for education experience. And it is only the leadership experience that has a positive effect on internationalization and on corporate performance. It's just having someone with foreign education is not actually making a contribution. Because if you just have a foreign education, you don't really develop a good understanding of the real business world, right? But if
Is that China specific or?
I just know, well, HR topics I delegate to Professor Tung, but this is a particular study from those particular, that the data are China data. But it's a paper where I'm sort of the 3rd author of a project. I can send you the paper if you're interested in. Yes, please.
First, I wanted to thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
You talked during the presentation a little bit about the attitudes of the people in those communities or those countries toward that incoming investment and that incoming business. In Vancouver here, the Asia Pacific Foundation, they do a study on attitudes of Canadians or people here on, for example, on China and incoming investment. And that's something that we'd like to use as a kind of a bellwether, I guess, of what Canadians are thinking about this kind of business model. In your experience of looking at Europe, are there similar studies that look at these attitudes of the local communities toward that incoming investment? And if so, is that changing? Is there any sense that there is a more welcoming attitude?
I think there are public opinion surveys of one sort of another, but I don't know any sources, or I don't know, can't point you in any particular direction. My general sense is that in Europe there are less sensitivities than in the US. I think in the US, but it has to do with the sectors. In the US, there's a lot of concern about what they call national security, which of course is played up by people who want to protect their own interests.
Well, the US is quite for an example, it's very much more political and
Yeah. So Canada, Australia, it's very much around natural resources, right? To have the foreigners own the stuff on the ground that, at least if you have one particular group of foreigners owning large chunks of your country, that creates sort of, is this really fair? Is it what we want? Certain anxieties. So the mining sector is always a sector that creates more debates, more sensitivities, and that in that sense, Canada and Australia are very similar, right? In Germany, most of the investment that we've seen are either trading or manufacturing. And as I mentioned, many of the very early investment were companies that were not viable on their own. They really faced financial difficulties. Those are sectors where there are much less sensitivities. Maybe locally there's some, that we need to get to each other, but it's the overall impact, social impact, is much less dramatic, and I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have the same degree of suspicion in Europe that compared to Canada or Australia, right? And US, I think US has its own political dynamic that plays a role. Having to accept that you're no longer number one in the world is a bit difficult. Well, I lived in Britain, they still haven't accepted they're no longer number one. But okay, different story. Other questions, Rosalind? Oh, sorry.
You started with Chinese overseas investment in Africa. There is actually your main concern, or their main concern is whether foreign investment create mutual benefits. And then you move on to Chinese investment in basically Germany. My sort of question is, are you going to make some sort of experiences from Germany and apply to Africa? And then in case of Germany, you never mentioned about mutual benefits.
That's a good question. I haven't thought, I put these different stories together, but I haven't made that connection. But the answer relates to the same issue I just given to that question. if it's investment in the manufacturing sector, and we're talking about a series of medium-sized companies, there's much less doubts as to whether it has huge positive or negative effects. The fact that the company continues to operate has positive effects, employment is secured. It's not so sensitive. The investment in Africa, we're talking about natural resources, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about very big loans between Chinese banks and local governments. These are politically more sensitive issues, right? So they're also more similar in that sense to what I said about Canada and Australia. On the interpersonal level, I made some remarks that sort of Chinese people and African people find it difficult to work with each other. Of course, European people also have problems with cultural differences and so on, but somehow the differences are not as big in either direction. But Chinese people are not used to work with Africans and vice versa. So I feel that the distance feels bigger. The suspicions seem to be more prevalent. And so the need for developing a mutual understanding is I think, very important. Or that what I observed. I was teaching an EMBA group who enrolled in a program which is organized by an institution. I mean, I come from Shanghai, right? So these are people who are potentially positively inclined towards Chinese people, but they still give me these stories, right? They're not necessarily there about themselves, but about. So I think that's there's definitely a difference on that score. Rosé.
Yes, I'd like to perhaps offer two observations that might address one of the questions that was asked in the back, also the question here, and there about the parallels between Chinese outward foreign direct investment and Japanese outward foreign direct investment. Obviously there are differences, but there are two commonalities. One is the Japanese multinationals, when they go overseas, when they make the investments in the industrialized countries, their management style is quite different from their management styles in the less developed countries. So when you compare, let's say, Chinese outward foreign direct investment in Germany vis-a-vis that in Ghana or in Africa, it's a very different style. So
yes.
Typically for the, and here you're expressing that the locals in Africa really do not like the Chinese that much because they feel the Chinese are being very hierarchical. That is exactly the same observation the local nationals have of the Japanese, that they tend to be more dictatorial. Whereas if you look at Japanese outward foreign direct investment in North America, they tend to be more accommodating to the local style. So in that sense, they try to please the local nationals a lot more than if they were making investment in a less developed country. And the second commonality that I see between Japanese and Chinese outward foreign direct investment is that the Japanese, despite the fact that they go overseas for different strategic reasons as you identified, they oftentimes have difficulty in attracting the best local talent to work for them. Okay, so in study after study, it shows that the Japanese cannot retain the best talent, local talent to work for them, and you cannot use expatriates all the time. In the case of the Chinese, for instance, in surveys that I did in Vancouver and also replicated in colleagues in Denmark, most locals do not want to work for Chinese firms. And so even though you make the distinction between state-owned enterprises and privately owned enterprises, in the minds of most of the respondents, they don't care. One of the primary reasons they say they don't want to work for Chinese companies is I don't want to work for the Chinese government. Period. This is what they equate Chinese firm with working for the Chinese government. And particularly the women respondents don't want to work for Chinese companies. Because they see that the Chinese companies tend to have a more masculine style of management, which would disenfranchise the women more. So I see those as important parallels.
Both China and Japan are hierarchical. They have hierarchical management style, and they are masculine. Even though China may have more women in career position than Japan, Japan is extreme on masculinity, right? But when they go to other emerging economies, they're likely to transfer their management practices. But what you're saying is when they go to North America, Western Europe, they're more accommodating. then they realize that actually the best way is to find sort of a middle way. And I think, I haven't done research on that, but it's consistent with my understanding. Yeah.
I think that's also consistent with one of the reasons why they go overseas to the developed countries. It's really to seek the management expertise as well.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it's really
Yeah.
a hunger attitude.
Yeah.
You know, I'm here to learn.
Yeah.
Whereas when the investment is made in a lesser developed country, it's more here I'm gonna.
I mean, just coming back to the example of China and Germany, which is what I know best, if you wanted the German specialists, who are the engineers in particular, right? They're highly qualified. They know their particular specialization very well. They're used to work with a high degree of autonomy, you know, the task delegation as opposed to detailed description of what you're supposed to do. And their working style, this high degree of autonomy, is part of why they're as productive as they are. So if you take these individuals and put them in this hierarchy, it would clash, it would destroy their capabilities. So they either leave or they become much less effective, because under a hierarchical management system, they wouldn't be so effective, right? And that is one of the challenges that the Chinese companies have integrating a German company that they acquired. And the other way around, if you want to transfer German management practice to China, or German technology, German efficiency to China, you'd have to change the organization, the structure. You have to reduce the hierarchies. You have to train the people. You would have to make very fundamental changes in the parent organization, which I think are not really. I can't really imagine that happening unless we're dealing with very small private companies. And actually, if you're successful in China, if you invest in educating your staff, they go across the street because the other guy gives slightly higher salary rate after you train them. So if you have too high job mobility, that of course deters investment in staff. So that's one of the management challenges they face. Okay.
Hi. So it appears that right now the foreign direct investments coming into Canada, especially BC, they're very asset-based. So, for example, people are buying land, buildings, things like that, even though it may not relate to their home country enterprises. So, is this just the stage of internationalization that we're at? How do the investors?
I should pass the question to the back row over there.
How do the investors then, let's say from China, move forward to, being able to understand or make acquisitions that are not so land or building based, and that's actually.
If individuals invest in real estate, that's financial investment from the individual perspective, right? It might be channeled through a company, and then it ends up as direct investment statistics, right? So you want to?
I just wanted to address that. We've done some looking into this area, and actually it's interesting that the resource field tends to get a lot of attention, and certainly it does make up the vast majority of the investments that are coming in Canada.
Resource, you mean now real estate or natural
resources?
Natural resources. In terms of capital investment,
yes.
Yeah. In terms of numbers of projects,
however,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes,
there are an increasing number of technology and information industry and service industry investments as well, whether that's engineering firms, technology firms, innovation firms, clean tech firms that are also starting to move into the space. So although the capital investment may not necessarily be so high, in terms of the total projects, resources, they crowd out just because of the sheer money.
It depends on how you, foreign direct investment statistics are chronically difficult to interpret. If you look at the largest 20 projects, natural resources dominates. If you look at the number of projects, you have a lot of individuals coming in making investments, right? You want to tell your story?
No.
No? Okay. Individuals, and of course, partly it's financial investment, right? You build up wealth in one place and you want to diversify your risk, so you make investment in another country. Or maybe you prefer to live in Vancouver, or you have prefer to have your kids grow up, go to Simon Fraser University, whatever. So you make an investment in Vancouver, right? So there are individual motivations, right? So China's investment in that sense is very, very diverse. And so if you talk about mining industry, individual entrepreneurs, or corporate investment in industrial sectors, the dynamics is very different. And I understand from the Canadian perspective, natural resources is very important to you guys. And if I was in Australia, I would have probably similar sort of questions, right? But it's also specific to Canada anyway. Okay. Thank you for your questions, and I'll be around if anyone wants to have some further conversations.
Thank you, Professor Meyer.
Thank you.
My name is Paul Crow, by the way. I'm an associate professor here, director of the David Lam Center.
And you give me a hongbao.
Thank you for coming. I'd like to say thank you to Professor Tome for bringing such a good guest here for our forum. Also, you should keep an eye out. We have 3 or 4 forums a year at SFU, Pacific Region Forums. So keep an eye on the David Lam Center website. Just Google David Lam Center, Pacific Region Forum, and you'll find future talks. I'd like to thank Ms. Edith Lowe, our administrator, for her capable work. And of course, 我黑发球，不一发财呀。
Thank you.